Queen Chronicles is the former Finance Minister, Honorable Seth Terkper. He is here. He will tell us much more about the plans they have going into the next administration of the NDC. Honorable, thank you so much for joining us here on Wizard TV. It's an honor to have you.
Thank you very much.
You're a big man.
Oh, no, really.
How has it been? 8 years, I mean, in opposition. How is it feeling?
We do various things personally, but you also know that over the 8 years, the NDC has been active, from Parliament to others, to quote my former colleague, now the Secretary, setting the record straight again. Because of the distortions and others. But on a personal note, I do some teaching, I do some consulting, and then I get involved where necessary in educating, the public about what is it that, we did. It wasn't easy to start with because, we left out of a hype and continue in a hype, but the cracks were showing very early. But I think the evidence is there, and I suppose that's what we are here to.
Very well. For you to even build upon all that you have done in the past, you need to tell us what you achieved whilst you were in office. But before then, paint a vivid picture of the current state of Ghana's economy to my viewers.
I like to compare it to households so that we can relate to what is going on. So it's like a family or a business which has been borrowing and borrowing and is unable to pay its debts, and no one is willing to give that household any more assistance. And I often say that for many, of us, the majority of people in Ghana don't come from affluent backgrounds. It's usually middle income if you are fortunate to have a job or be endowed with, let's say, some farms and other traditional forms of wealth. The majority are low income people, and many of us can connect that to go to school. Our parents have to go and borrow. An uncle, an auntie, a friend, a relative. You go to school, and because you have to do back then maybe 5 years of secondary education or 3 years, 2 years of sixth form, and if you are doing well and your parents want to support you, another what? Then 3 years, I did 4 years because of canvas and education. So it took a very long period over which our parents went to traditional markets, sold less than an acre and whatever. But the one thing they always learn to do, they borrow to pay our fees, but they also learn to pay back. Right? Otherwise, you cannot go back for the loan. And it may be maybe out of illness or something. So I'm not saying that those who necessarily had to stop education that was the principal reason. But maybe because education or something. Health, for health reasons or something, some may drop. But there's of people who have been able to go through that. And sometimes when you have a job, you may even end up paying some of the debts. So I think that's the way to see Ghana now.
Is it that bad?
Well, it's bad, yes. I don't want to mince words. The situation in which we are is bad. We are among only a few countries that have not overborrowed, but have defaulted in paying the debt. And this is the second time. The first time we came close, and our debt was forgiven from over 150% of GDP. We came down close to between 25 and 30%. That is the amount of debt that was forgiven. And I'm talking about HIPIC. I'm talking about HIPIC. It brought in a lot of resources, for the then administration, the His Excellency Kufuor's, administration. They would have defaulted. That's when we would have defaulted, because we took debt all the way up. But we were among a few countries, and so the debt was forgiven. Then we accelerated. We'll come to that. I don't want to, but you know, through oil and despite difficulties, you know. So now we have. If you ask me how bad is that? We have defaulted. This is we have defaulted. We stopped paying the people we owe, except for a few. Right, the multilateral institutions. Completely. They came around us and said, okay, this time it's not going to be full forgiveness.
Okay.
It's going to be suspension.
Okay.
But there's an element of reduction of the debt. But whereas under HIPIC, it was mainly outside countries and their taxpayers that bore the burden. Remember the taxpayers in other countries. Now, we think that the consequences of failure must come home. So the first haircut was suffered by who? Ghanaians. Under HIPIC. Ghanaian citizens. Those who had lent to the government, to banks, and there was no haircut. So I think that for me is the first warning. Then the externals came, and even though there was some haircut, it wasn't substantial. It was substantial, but the other element to it is that we had to defer part of the debt. It wasn't forgiven, and repayment of the domestic one has started. Some of the foreign ones are also foreign due, and so despite difficulties, unlike HIPIC, where we are actually getting revenues and where would have was coming to the budget. Now we have to start repayment, and it does not end because the debt that was suspended is waiting. And the best this government could do was to kick it down the road for future governments and future generations. The reason I'm recounting this is two reasons. First of all, we may not be third time lucky. From forgiveness to suspension to reduction and others. And I think, therefore, the next administration, which we all believe is going to be the John and Jane administration, are going to face this hurdle, more than this administration, which kicked all of these things down, the road. But the other notion I'd like to dispel is to say that the NDC never suffered a major crisis. It's untrue. Unless you are forgetting the global financial crisis, which started from 2008 or 2007 and lasted until a decade or so, certainly more than 5 years for many countries, which also, so they didn't call it global financial crisis for nothing. It affected the whole group, which then Mills Mahama administration fell right into in 2009. And mind you, before HIPIC became the most severe crisis ever, the global financial crisis was the most severe crisis ever since the 1930s, the Great Depression. So the world has come through ups and downs, certainly. But when you talk about deep crisis, the world has gone through three. Now, I'm saying this because we need to understand the background of why the Mills Mahama administration decided that now that we have oil, let us prepare better for crisis. We will come to, to discuss this. It is out of that, an abundance of caution, that they balance spending against investment in infrastructure. There was a lot of infrastructure. But you couldn't continue with the infrastructure. And certainly this administration has not continued with that infrastructure And whatever little they did, the outcome is debt and debt default. Compared to the Mills Mahama administration and later Mahama in Atta administration, that did significant infrastructure, but set money aside to pay down and refinance the entire $750 million that's the first sovereign bond. We refinanced 200 using, the sovereign bond for 2015, which was also used to support the gas infrastructure so that we could produce more power. We had to build infrastructure, as I said, and therefore part of the money, substantial part, was given, of the oil revenue was given to GNPC to prepare the country better in terms of its further developments of oil fields, which have not yet come out. Then of course we know the other ones. One which said because we ourselves face domestic crisis and because global crisis also affects us. In fact, some of the domestic ones, like cocoa prices going down and the rest has external impact, demand going down and the rest. And because we need to, as I said, build infrastructure, this is the background so that we can prepare better than we did for global financial crisis, we did for droughts, we did for, other like the Burkina Dam that is open, spillages and the rest, and you see our own preparedness when we had our own, spill. So these are what you call, in economics they call it counter-cyclical funds.
Okay.
It's a cycle. Cyclical means it's a cycle. And so you have good times and the bad times come. It goes, good times, bad times come. And the countries that succeed prepare during the good time. You don't prepare for crisis during a crisis. Again to the household.
Prepare ahead.
Yes, again to the household. In the night when your son starts screaming, or a few weeks to the reopening, right? That's when, maybe some money would have been saved, right, to take you to school. Even if you have friends, you have to prepare for your kids going to school. Or for those of us who went with assistance from others and the rest, that's when you prepare to repay that loan so that you can continue. Yeah. We didn't have such a mechanism, and that explains the stabilization fund. We didn't have a solid mechanism for paying debt. That explains the sinking fund and the contingency fund and all the ones that we know were put in place. So this is the rationale. So this is, in essence, in summary, what I'm saying is that we should dispel the notion that the NDC never went through hardship. Mind you, I have not spoken about the pipeline, which was broken, which was called Doomsor, and the reason was forgotten and made as if it is non-performance. Right? I've not spoken about single span. Right. We did all this, and I'll pause for you. We did all this with one oil field.
Okay.
And we left 2 oil fields. So
that should be enough.
More than enough.
Yeah, so I should be asking you, what has contributed to the failure?
And the dissipation of, the logic and the principles which I just enunciated. Because the buffers were cleaned, we know it. Borrowing was accelerated while the sinking fund was depleted, right? And we just continued the borrowing. But remember that by the time we were leaving, we had actually, with the one oil field, started to reduce, the borrowing so that we'll be able to continue borrowing. And borrowing is not a bad one. And you have people saying that, why don't we stop borrowing? Why? No, it's just like a family, like a business.
But is that not part of the reasons why we find ourselves in the mess?
Yes, because
we borrow too much.
No, because yes, we borrow too much because we do not have a repayment mechanism. That's simple. That is what it is. Because everybody knows, if in terms of natural resources, in terms of gold, diamond, cocoa, oil has added is relative. Ghana is better off than many countries that are not endowed, low-income countries. Botswana is doing very well under bauxite. Sorry, diamond, right, which is almost the same commodity, and tourism and others. So, and you know, there have been affluent people who, as a result of some calamity or whatever, the businesses fail. Maybe there is a failure, some accident or something. You know, but there are those who also, because of you borrow, you don't pay, you come and take your car. If you take a mortgage, you don't pay, you come and take your. So those lessons are there, and I would have excused, you know, your question, you know, but for the fact that we use one oil field to achieve some results, and the deficit we achieved for the last 8 years is still, you know, the best. Our debt ratio went down, you know, as well. And the best example I see about the usefulness of those programs was that when the COVID struck, the one which was being used as excuse, you remember the first money that was used was money which we left in the stabilization fund, right? Which had been, none was added, the entire 250 million at the time that was two, we left it with one oil field. Now, if you had added with 2 additional oil fields, which were more than we were leaving behind, one oil field was about 70,000 barrels. By the time COVID struck, we were achieving about 180 to 190,000 barrels, almost, you know, 3 times. But let's just make it even pro rata. Assume it was 70, 70, 70, 3 oil fields. If we let 251, and the second oil field, some government had put in another 250, third oil field put in another 250, the total was 750. You agree with me that we would have been better prepared with 750 than we were, you know, with 250. So this is how you relate to compare the two. It's a very practical example. And you would have gone to the IMF to borrow 250 for COVID, not 1 billion.
You just mentioned the IMF, so one will also make the argument or case that under your watch, we were at the IMF. It's the same situation we find ourselves in currently. What would you say is the difference here?
We borrow from the IMF, and the type of borrowing we did is called enhanced, you know, ECF, you know, enhanced credit facility, which means ECF. It has the same name as the current one. So let's call it ECF 2015 and ECF 2023. Just as that was just slightly below $1 billion. So the first fact is, you go to the IMF when you're in crisis. And there was during the global financial crisis, you know, there were some advanced countries that went to the IMF. Ireland, Portugal, you know, Spain, Greece. Greece was a famous one. So they went to the IMF. But they learned to prepare for crisis. So during COVID, they never went back to the IMF. The US was better prepared for COVID than it was for the global financial crisis.
Okay.
It saved about $3 trillion US from the global financial crisis, which it channeled, you know, into, you know, the vaccines, the speed with which the vaccines were discovered. You know, labs and others to discover that. That is what we are talking about, being prepared. Now, another difference in answer to your question is that we even left some money, because remember the ECF was 2015 and we left in 2016 and it was 3 years. So we are buried down 1 year. The rest came in, you know, under the current administration. And then we left all those buffers, which they also inherited, 2 plus 1 oil fields, which they also inherited. So the second main difference is that they should have been better prepared than we were. Just as, you know, the Mills Mahama administration should have been better prepared and tried to be better prepared than the Rawlings administration. To whom more is given, as they say, more is what's expected.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, having dissipated, you know, most of these resources, the warnings could have come. And let me give you an example of one such warning which prompts you to change tactics. The single spine arrears was underestimated. And that's why the single spine was delayed for about 1 year into 2010 to reset. By the time the reset came, to use the word. So by the time the reset came from what was done in the past, which is what we're going to do. So it's a reset too. It's not a reset
so
one.
this is actually not the first one.
Yeah, that's what I said. It's a reset too. We started borrowing to pay the arrears until we realized that the amount was huge. So you remember Senchi, you remember Terkper, you remember who? You negotiate at the table. And we started, you know, to phase out. We decided to phase it out of our own revenue than to continue borrowing. Right. So when the alarm bells were coming, we should have gone to the fund earlier, right? Because it's self-inflicted crisis in this case, before COVID. That's why the IMF says.
So we delayed.
We delayed, and that's what the IMF clarifies, that there were pre-existing conditions. The economy was already in trouble, right? Before, you know, because nobody's underestimating COVID, but don't put everything on COVID, right? So I think what went wrong is the fact, not realizing that the borrowing was, you know, becoming excessive and we're having difficulty, and especially when we had to, you know, give up almost 1/3 to be able to get to test the zero coupon, you know, bond. Should have been, you know, quite a warning for us, and that was rather the peak at which we said we're a proud nation and we didn't need the IMF. So it got a bit late, you know, and it is only when we were shut from the, you know, from borrowing from the market, you know, that, you know, we made the effort. And the outcome is that you had more loans, because you took 1 billion from the IMF, you added, you know, but there was some grants that also came. Remember, another SDR, 1 billion. World Bank and others gave us about 1 billion. Development partners, you know, African Development Bank, they all gave us. Bank of Ghana at the time, remember, gave 1.7 billion US dollars. So often when I say that, you know, this government got about 6 billion US dollars, you know, in addition to all the buffers and things I was talking about, and that it could have even if you excuse it, could have used the 6 billion to turn around the economy. The hole was probably too deep. You know, that it didn't even make an impact. So we had to go to the, you know, to the fund.
Do you agree with people who believe that mismanagement, corruption, over bloated government size, and a couple of others are reasons why we are finding ourselves in this situation?
Yeah, of course. Under pressure, you remember the COVID report. So I'm not the one to say, you know, the way in which those funds, you know, were used, including parties, you know, and the rest that were thrown. So yes, there's an element of truth in that. Secondly, I already said also that the warning signs were there and should have been, you have taken advantage of it, you know, earlier, you know, but also the borrowing was just excessive. And when you are borrowing and your percentage begins to hit about 70, which is where we were headed, right, you know, and had to, you know, take significant measures. So that's when, you know, you put in your own homegrown policy. You know, our own homegrown policy, which we used to negotiate the fund. We say, hey, we are now a bit of big boys. We know what we want to do, you know, going forward. But we need your assistance. But this time we don't want to sit at the table and be lectured. We have reviewed what we want to do. You know, and we think that, you know, we have some things which we can put on the table, you know, then you can comment on them, and then you can also suggest to us what we can do, because that's how you get, you know, learning to do things for yourself. You know, it's a way of getting out of the situation. And like the Asian Tigers and the rest, you know, which went out of fund programs and the rest, that's what you do. You begin to look critically, like when we're using the oil. We wanted to use the oil money, build buffers, so that, because it's when you're in crisis that you go to the fund. So you prepare for crisis and you can manage it. You know, and certainly we didn't go for 3 billion UCF loan. Just as I said, it was something less than, you know, 500, even that part of it. With all the record that we had, we didn't even use all of that money. Right? So yes, there's an element. And then of course we all know the misuse of the ESLA, you know, funds, which were designed to resolve the energy sector crisis, and we are still, and it wasn't taking off after the 3 to 5 years. Rather, the rates were increased and the period extended, and today that loan, which was that flows which were collateralized into a loan, is part of the debt default.
It's quite dire. Now, you mentioned earlier about the haircuts. I mean, how better would you have managed the situation during the DDEP? How better would you have handled the situation so that we wouldn't have seen the pensioners?
The best way is to avoid it.
How is that going to be?
That's why we had the debt repayment mechanism. Because remember that by 20, and the NPP made a very big issue out of it. By 2015, the bond I was talking about, we did it at 10.2%.
Okay.
But because we had set up the sinking fund just before that and started paying down our debt, when we did the 2016 bond, it was at 9%. The 9.2 or 9%, which started a decline of the rate at which we are. And that is clear evidence that if you prepare to put things, you know, under control yourself, they will take note of it. Remember, that was when we started putting our government bonds on our own Ghana Stock Exchange, which some of those Ghanaians who bought some of those bonds also have just suffered a haircut, because it's an external bond. So those who saved in only domestic, right, suffered the haircut. But those who invested in our bond, if we were not doing well, we couldn't have floated those bonds on the Ghana Stock Exchange. And anybody who challenges me, I would say, where is all the bonds? Where is the increase of the bonds, early bonds that were issued were also floated? And that is because Ghanaians began to have confidence. You know, because the foreigners were also coming to actually invest on the Ghana Stock Exchange. We did a dollar bond, you know, in 2015, going to 2016, I think after 2015, and the rate was 6%, $200 million US dollars. You know, which is what you would call your diaspora bond, because we just testing those principles. Today the market is gone. The bonds are no longer being traded, and we are relying on treasury bills, which is a very dangerous way of financing a budget. Right. So I would say to you that Ghana and the middle income countries must learn to do things differently. And that's the only way in which, you know, we would have, you know, stopped this, you know, habit of, you know, borrowing and borrowing without, you know, repaying.
We will zoom into the the very few things that the next NDC administration would do and ensure that the Ghana's economy is back to where it used to be, or get better than it used to be. But I'm more curious about some of the achievements you have chalked in office. If you look at the indicators, you can talk about the GDP, you can talk about the currency,
the debt.
Exactly. You can also talk about, unemployment rate. Currently, we are hovering around 14%. Others believe that it is even more than that as well. And quite a number of the indicators currently under this administration doesn't look good. But under your watch, what were the achievements?
Well, let me come to the reason first. The first reason is leadership. And we had a leader who was supportive of the policies, right, who knew what we were doing, who unfortunately, when we were doing the 2016 budget in 2015, that's when crude oil prices fell. And we had to roll back, you know, many of you know, like the e-schools and others that we were doing, right? Some use that and say, okay, that's why you should have spent the money, right? And
because you're heading into an election.
Yes, but we're building infrastructure, right? And my question is, you say we were heading into elections.
Yeah.
Did you believe we would have won? It's not hindsight. Back then, did we believe we would have won the 2017 election?
If you have spent?
We spent. Who says we didn't spend? Terminal 3, Harbour projects, right? A travel plant from mills into pipelines, reverse pipeline, increase in exports, right? And let's relate it to the things that, you know, matter to Ghanaians. So let's take Terminal 3. How many jobs did Terminal 3, you know, produce? We are counting now. Terminal 3 produced more jobs than Terminal 1 and 2 put together. And now Terminal 2, which we refurbish, is going to be used for foreign. We created those jobs. E-schools. Is that not how infrastructure, you create jobs?
Yeah.
Sustainable jobs. Because if you build a secondary school, like our secondary schools from Nkrumah era, they didn't go anywhere. You recruit teachers and you recruit teachers, they retire, some go to their Lord in peace because they are satisfied about how, you know, students like me and you have become and all that, right? So you continue creating, you know, jobs for nurses, for teachers, for doctors. You know, so I think it's a perspective. Because we had been used to creating jobs through the civil service for a very long time. So when you say you didn't do much for the economy, Cocoa Roads, how many engineers were out then in the bush before the roads were done? How many laborers? How many accounts officers? How many administrators? And how many more jobs had we continued? Even resurfacing, would we have? Are these not more sustainable means of creating jobs? Let me give you the last example there. The expansion of the harbour. Terminal Takrady, which in total are larger than the original investment to some extent, with warehousing, with, you know, clearance, more ships, bigger ships and larger ships, transshipments and all that. How else do you create jobs? So I think it's we are buying into the hype. We are buying into the hype that going into the elections, you know, we're not spending. No, many of those, you know, programs were commissioned, and because of the design, the smart borrowing, the IMF did not stop us from borrowing. Remember? Because what we
were
did
still in
was,
the market.
We're in the
there
market.
were options.
Exactly.